What if I told you that an English king, with a single decision, managed to break the most powerful banks in Europe? We're not talking about 2008, nor about some modern crisis you might know. We're in 1345, and this story will completely change how you see the power and the fragility of money. Picture Florence in the 1300s for a moment. Not the city of museums and tourists we know today, but a true financial empire in the heart of Tuscany. Stone streets echoed with the clinking of gold coins. Merchants shouted prices in different languages, and the smell of spices from the east blended with the sound of hammers building ever grander palaces. Right in the middle of this hustle and bustle were the banks that literally financed Europe. They weren't banks like we know today, with branches and ATMs. They were true family dynasties, where every transaction was sealed with personal trust and every loan was a bet on the future of entire kingdoms. The Peruzzi and Bardi families weren't just bankers. They were the rock stars of medieval money. Their palaces dominated Florence's skyline, their trade routes stretched from London to Constantinople, and their vaults held riches that entire kings envied. They financed everything from small local merchants to military campaigns that decided the fate of nations. In this almost fantastical prosperity, where art was beginning to bloom with the first signs of the Renaissance, these bankers saw themselves as masters of a new world, where money spoke louder than noble titles. They were about to learn a lesson that would forever change the rules of the financial game. But why would a king from the north, on a faraway island called England, become the nightmare of these Florentine magnates? Edward III of England had a problem typical of any ambitious medieval monarch: big dreams and empty coffers. In his castle at Westminster, London, he planned campaigns that would cost fortunes, buildings that would impress generations, and armies that would maintain his power over ever-expanding territories. The problem was, kings, no matter how powerful, sometimes needed money faster than they could collect taxes. That's when the paths of London and Florence crossed in a way no one could have foreseen the devastating consequences. The Peruzzi and Bardi, eager for prestigious clients and seduced by the idea of having a king as debtor, opened their coffers to Edward III. These weren't small loans. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of gold florins, a sum that today would be worth billions. For the Florentine bankers, lending to a king seemed like the perfect business. After all, who has better guarantees of repayment than someone who can tax an entire kingdom? Who could be more trustworthy than someone who rules by divine right? This logic, which seemed absolutely solid at the time, was about to prove tragically flawed. The contracts were signed, the gold changed hands, and for a while, everything worked perfectly. Edward III funded his campaigns, the bankers received hefty interest, and Florence remained Europe's most respected financial center. But there was a variable in the equation no one was properly calculating. What happens when kings decide they don't want to pay their debts anymore? And that's exactly what turned 1345 into the year that forever changed the rules of the European financial game. 1345. This number should be engraved in the memory of anyone who works in finance, because it was in this year that something happened which revealed an inconvenient truth. Kings can also break contracts. Edward III, facing financial difficulties beyond his capacity to meet obligations, made a decision that sent shockwaves from London to Florence, across all European trade routes. The English king simply declared that he would not pay the massive debts he owed the Florentine bankers. It wasn't a negotiation, it wasn't a request for extension, it wasn't an interest renegotiation proposal. It was a pure and simple default. A unilateral decision that turned hundreds of thousands of gold florins into worthless paper overnight. The news spread across medieval Europe as fast as information could travel at the time. Letters carried by knights, rumors whispered at trade fairs, desperate merchants rushing from city to city, trying to salvage what they could from their investments. Within weeks, the trust that sustained the entire Florentine banking system simply evaporated. The banks of the Peruzzi and Bardi, which for generations had been synonymous with strength and prestige, collapsed. It wasn't a gradual fall. It wasn't a slowly developing crisis. It was a complete financial meltdown, sudden and devastating. Families that had dominated European finance for centuries saw their empires crumble in just months. But what happened in Florence after this financial earthquake was even more remarkable than the crisis itself. Florence woke up after 1,345 inches, a completely different world. The city that had grown used to being Europe's financial heart discovered, in the harshest way possible, What it means when trust, such an abstract yet fundamental word, simply disappears. The consequences of the Peruzzi and Bardi collapse went far beyond numbers in accounting books. Imagine a Florentine merchant who had outstanding credits with the failed banks. Overnight, the funds he counted on to expand his business simply no longer existed. Artisans who depended on orders financed by these banks saw their contracts canceled. Workers who supported entire families with jobs tied to the financial sector suddenly found themselves unemployed without warning. But perhaps the deepest impact was cultural. Florence was more than a financial hub. It was an artistic cradle. The same bankers who financed kings were also the patrons commissioning artworks, supporting artists, building churches and palaces. When the money dried up, artistic patronage collapsed. The flow of commissions dropped drastically, and many artists saw their careers threatened by the sudden lack of resources. Socially, something even more dangerous than the financial crisis grew: fear. The Florentine population, raised to believe in the solidity of their banking institutions, discovered that even the most powerful could fail overnight. This fear crystallized into a proverb born directly from this traumatic experience. "He who lends to the king always loses." A phrase that encapsulated centuries of bitter experience with sovereign loans. And out of this chaos would rise Florence's new money masters, with strategies very different from their predecessors. From the ruins of the Peruzzi and Bardi emerged names that would change not only Florence, but the entire history of European capitalism. The Medici, the Pazzi, the Strozzi families that had been closely watching the financial disaster of 1345 and learning valuable lessons from their predecessors' mistakes. They didn't appear by chance. They appeared with a completely new strategy. The new Florentine bankers adopted a radically different approach. First, diversification of risk. Never again all eggs in the same royal basket. Second, stricter contracts, with stronger guarantees and clauses protecting creditors. Third, and perhaps most important, a much more sophisticated understanding that lending to sovereigns is inherently risky, no matter how powerful they seem. But 1345 wasn't just the year of the banking collapse. It was also when other calamities piled onto Europe. Famine struck several regions. Outbreaks of disease spread along trade routes. And, on the horizon loomed something even more devastating: the Black Death, which would arrive just a few years later and drastically change Europe's demographics. This convergence of crises, financial, social, health-related, created an environment where the old certainties simply no longer worked. Edward III's England, financially weakened by the very default it had caused, struggled to find new resources and stabilize its diplomatic alliances. Florence, in turn, lost its dominant position as Europe's creditor, and other Italian city-states rose to more important roles on the continental financial stage. What was born from this crisis was a new kind of relationship between finance and politics, where the question, who will pay, became just as important as who is allied with whom in diplomatic negotiations. 7 centuries have passed since 1345, but there's something eerily familiar about the Florentine bankers' crisis. If you swap florins for dollars, kings for presidents, and letters for emails, the basic structure of the crisis remains strangely unchanged. The same overconfidence, the same concentration of risk, the same underestimation of sovereigns' ability to simply refuse to pay their debts. When we look at modern financial crises, be it Latin America's debt crisis in the 82nds, Greece's crisis in 2010, or any situation where governments default on private creditors, we are seeing direct echoes of what happened with Edward III. The only difference is scale and speed, but the fundamental mechanism is exactly the same. The expression, "he who lends to the king always loses," born from Florence's traumatic experience, didn't die in the Middle Ages. It evolved, grew more sophisticated, gained new technical names like sovereign risk or emerging market default, but the essence remains identical. Governments, no matter how stable they seem, always have the nuclear option of simply not paying what they owe. What has changed since 1345 are the instruments. Today, we have derivatives, swaps, complex bonds, instant electronic payment systems. But the basic risk, the possibility that those with political power decide not to honor financial commitments, remains exactly the same. This historical continuity shows us something profound about the nature of money and power. They are in constant tension, and periodically that tension explodes in crises that redefine the rules of the game. Let's go back to that question we asked at the beginning. How did an English king manage to break Europe's most powerful banks with a single decision? Now you know the answer. But more important than the answer is understanding why this story still matters today. Edward III was neither the first nor the last ruler to discover that political power can, in extreme moments, simply ignore financial obligations. What makes his story special is that it happened in a moment of historical transition, when Europe's financial system was both sophisticated enough to create systemic crises, yet still primitive enough for us to clearly see the basic mechanisms at work. The Peruzzi and Bardi bankers made the classic mistake of confusing power with security. They believed that lending to the most powerful man in England was automatically safer than lending to a local merchant. They discovered, in the most painful way possible, that political power and financial reliability are completely different things. This lesson crystallized into a proverb that crossed centuries: "He who lends to the king always loses." Not because kings are inherently dishonest, but because they have something other debtors don't: the power to change the rules of the game when those rules no longer suit them. The 1345 crisis taught us that financial interconnection, which already existed in medieval Europe, is a double-edged sword. When things go well, it multiplies prosperity. When something goes wrong, it spreads the crisis much faster and much farther than anyone thinks possible. Today, when we see news about sovereign debt crises, when we hear about countries unable to pay their creditors, when we watch debates on governments' fiscal sustainability, we are seeing direct echoes of that distant 1345. The technology has changed, the scale has changed, the speed has changed, but the fundamental dynamic between political power and financial obligations remains exactly the same. And perhaps the most important lesson we can take from the story of Edward III and the Florentine bankers is this: in an interconnected world, trust is simultaneously the most valuable and the most fragile asset. It takes generations to build and can be destroyed in a matter of days. That's why, the next time you hear someone say, "He who lends to the king always loses," remember that this phrase carries 7 centuries of human experience with the complex relationship between money and power. And also remember that, apparently, we still haven't fully learned this lesson.